Welcome to Basic Black. Some of you are joining us on our broadcast, and others of you are joining us on Facebook and Twitter. I'm Phillip Martin, Senior Investigative Reporter, GBH Center for Investigative Reporting. Callie Crosley is off. Tonight, the lives of transgender men and women. We, like you, are dealing with the effects of the coronavirus pandemic and are taking precautions. We are working with limited staff, and our guests are joining us remotely. Black transgender people of color often face higher levels of discrimination, from health care and housing to employment, violence, and even death. The latest information shows an increase in deaths in the transgender community, many who are trans women of color. And while the new administration has taken some actions on discriminatory practices in favor of the LGBTQ+ community, in cities and neighborhoods, trans people of color continue to fight for equal rights. What do Black trans people of color experience on a day-to-day basis? What protections and rights around equality are needed? And what are some solutions to improve the lives and relationships between the transgender community and the cisgender community? Joining us, Chastity Bowick, Executive Director of the Transgender Emergency Fund in Boston. Kaden Mohamed, Chair of the Steering Committee of the Massachusetts Transgender Political Coalition. Dreya Catozzi, Executive Director of Urban Trans Women's Center, and Espinoza-Madrigal, Executive Director of Lawyers for Civil Rights in Boston. Welcome to all of you.
Thank you for having us.
Well, I think the operative question really is, how are you doing in this environment? We've seen in 2020 37 killings of transgender women across this country, the majority of them Black. And Chastity, this is trauma of an extraordinary nature. How are you doing, and how is this issue being addressed on a local level?
The question of how am I doing is, at the moment, sometimes I don't know. I take it on a day-by-day basis, seeing as though a lot of the clients that we serve through the Transgender Emergency Fund has experienced or are currently experiencing some form of discrimination, whether that be in housing or employment or in shelters or in substance abuse treatment centers. So what we're trying to do here locally is to make sure that these resources are available. We've asked for a seat at the table for so many years, and now we're creating our own table to provide the services that we need for our community. But in retrospect, we need other people in our community, like our cisgender allies and family members, to also stand up for us when it comes to policy change and policy rights, especially in Boston. We are known as, everything's okay for trans people in Massachusetts. They can get surgeries, they can get this, but that is not the case, because we still have to overcome homelessness, overcome employment harassment and discrimination. And then furthermore, it's like a lot of these programs in the city that are getting funds to service our community only want us for an HIV test. So it's like so many different things that we have to break down before we can even get to the root of the problem. So every day here for us at the Transgender Emergency Fund is just fighting that fight every day, working with our local politicians, DA Rachel Rowland's office, to try to figure out how can we best support our community, and we need our allies to do so.
Dreya, to that same question that I just asked Chastity, how are you doing, and how are you responding to this, if you will, crisis across this country, including the violence that was just outlined? It's not just deaths, of course; it's assaults, it's insults in the streets, so on and so forth. How are you doing?
Personally, myself, I take it day by day. I don't move through this world as with fear. I'm aware of what's going on. My goal is to continue to advocate and make society aware of what's going on. But personally, myself, I don't move through the world with fear of what's going on, because I wouldn't be able to, I don't feel like I would be able to advocate properly if I did. I'm aware of the realities of what's going on. Like Chastity said, we do need our cisgender allies to have our backs. I'm not one to wait for policies to be put in place before I decide to live my life. I don't think anyone else should have to within the trans community, especially trans women of color. It's heartbreaking, and it's hard sometimes because it makes you angry, it makes you sad when you see the things that are going on in the world and the barriers that we have to continue to overcome by just trying to live our lives. And it's a hard road, but with people like myself, Chastity, and those of us that are continue to advocate and fight and make our voices heard and be out there in front of everyone and letting them know this is not acceptable. We will not stand for it. We are creating our own space and to make our way through this world and move through the world. But I don't feel like we need to wait for a policy to be put in place for our trans sisters, our trans family to live their lives. We need to take what's ours. We deserve to live in this world. We deserve to move in this world. We deserve to have healthcare, housing, employment. We shouldn't have to constantly educate people on what is, in my mind, should be just the obvious of what we should be able to have. We need to start making choices with our hearts and our minds. And so with that being said, personally, myself, I don't move through the world with fear, but I move and I continue to fight, and I'll continue to fight and make my voice heard, and thankful for the platforms that are provided for us to continue to educate people and let them know it's out there. And we need our cisgender allies to have our back. But we can't wait for that.
That's powerful. Not moving through the world with fear. Kaden, of course, the fear is not just being felt. It's being felt primarily by Black transgender women, but who are also pushing back against that fear. In terms of transgender men, and in terms of the response of city government to the type of violence and assaults we've seen, but also the resources that are needed, what's your role been primarily? And how have you people responded to your, first of all, moving to Boston in 2010? The story about you coming to Wellesley is very well known. There was a lot of resistance to you coming to Wellesley. Have you found that same resistance in terms of your role in the city and in terms of finding resources for transgender people across the board?
Yeah, I think there's a lot to say about that. I think one thing to keep in mind is, I operate myself personally in the context of Boston. And I think we need to consider the fact that if you're in a city, you often have access to a lot of resources that you might not if you were somewhere else. So, if we're talking about Boston itself, I think, the city has done some things around policy. Massachusetts, I think as a whole is fairly okay when it comes to policy. But I think as Dreya and Chastity both kind of spoke a little bit about, it's sort of beyond just what the city is doing, right? It's beyond having policies or practices that are in place. And, the Massachusetts Transgender Political Coalition right now is really trying to focus on this idea of not legal equity, but of lived equity, right? So how do we go to a doctor and not get discriminated against? How do we access education, employment, housing, et cetera, without having to bump up against these barriers that are in place? And, it's not legal to discriminate against transgender people in employment in Massachusetts. That doesn't mean it doesn't happen, right? So I think we need to get away from this idea that policies or government officials or people in those roles and settings are going to help us or solve these problems, and recognize that we really do, as Dreya and Chastity said, need our cis allies to really step up. And we need that to happen not just in those systems, but outside of that too. We need a lot of education. I think it needs to be part of the education for all doctors, all teachers, all people in all of these settings, so that we're not having these problems occur, whether the policies are there or not, because policies don't change behavior. Policies don't change minds and opinions. They help. They can provide sort of a pathway to, potentially getting support if you need it. But even then, it's hit or miss a lot of the time. So that's not enough for me. For me, it's pushing way beyond that and really working for this lived equity idea where transgender people, regardless of whether they're trans women, trans men, non-binary, whatever other identities they may have, it doesn't matter, that they're not going to experience these things in any of the systems or settings that we are currently experiencing them in.
And in the sense of policy, I totally understandable. But right now, it seems like if there's one thing that is absolutely needed is basically have the law on your side, because around the country we're seeing efforts. Waking up today to a headline that Arkansas, for example, has passed a bill that basically criminalizes transsexuals in sports. You have situations across the country where legislators are basically militating against transsexual people. And one of the questions I have for you, Yvonne, is in the legal field. Massachusetts, of course, stands shoulders above others. But even here, you find problematic issues in terms of legal barriers for trans people. Can you address that and what the Lawyers Committee is doing basically to push back against that?
Yes, thank you, Phil, for having me. It's a pleasure to be here with such a distinguished panel. And from the legal perspective, I really want to go back actually to something that Kaden said, which is the distinction between legal equality and lived equality, or as Tizan put it, equity. We have laws on the books that protect people against discrimination on the basis of gender, gender expression, gender identity, on the basis of their race, right? That doesn't mean necessarily that people aren't experiencing discrimination exactly along those lines when it comes to the workplace, when it comes to housing, and when it comes to access to other institutions such as healthcare or education. And so what we're seeing is, of course, that the law does not always make all of these incidents just go away. We can have strong protections, but that still needs significant monitoring and enforcement. And without the enforcement component, we are simply not going to be able to protect folks as they're experiencing discrimination or worse, violence. We just saw, for example, in Atlanta, murders that were not identified as hate crimes. This is a lived reality for many people in the trans community whose violence and assaults are not considered hate incidents because law enforcement just simply doesn't categorize them that way. That doesn't mean that they shouldn't be categorized. They absolutely must be and should be, because these incidents are incidents of discrimination, violence, and hate crimes that are specifically based on bias because of the person's identity. And so we need to do a lot more work just to get our institutions to understand that these things need to have teeth and that you need to call it out.
The institutions, yes. And I think that it's also been pointed out here on this panel that you also have to go beyond the institutions to a society-wide, if you will, inculcation. And it's interesting to note that the Black Lives Matter movement nationally has largely, in many places, has been led by black transgender women. And and that seems to be a point of solidarity. Chastity, has that the Black Lives Matter movement served to bridge the gap between the, if you will, the cisgender community and the trans community, as you talked about earlier, and that's something that you greatly hope for?
Yes. Just before I answer that question, so I just want to say you mentioned the word transsexual earlier, and that's not a word that we use to identify ourselves in the trans community, because it's oftentimes, we are oftentimes looked at as sexual objects, and that word heightens that belief. So we use transgender.
That's a very good point. You're absolutely correct. That's a very good point. That's part of the education. And I, among others, basically require that type of admonition in order to keep it, in order for us to move forward. I think that those lessons have to be inculcated by society as a whole. And you're right. I'm among those who again has to be educated, and you've done a great job of addressing that issue. And to the question of Black Lives Matter, how has that helped to, if you will, create a bridge to the cisgender community?
Well, first, I felt a large disconnect with the movement. Right after the unfortunate incident with George Floyd last year, though a group of Black Lives Matter protesters attacked a trans woman of color. So yeah, I found myself in trying to stuck, like I am Black, that is part of my identity, but I am also trans. That is always going to be stand out and be first and foremost that I fight for. So how can I say Black Lives Matter, or is it only some Black Lives Matter and not Black trans lives? So that has been kind of like the struggle for me, but I continuously try to work with Black Lives Matter movements and also the Black Men Foundation here in Boston to try to bridge that gap between our two communities, because we have to start somewhere. So we even started a session where we had transgender women of color and straight Black men in a room together and started breaking down some of the stigmas and stereotypes that are placed upon these two communities. Because at the end of the day, we need to understand that we are all people of color and that we can do more together than we can apart. So we just need them to see us as people and not see us as sex objects, not see us as just only sex workers or only people who are affected with HIV. We need to be seen as Black humans first. And I think that's where we have to start the conversation. And this is something that's needed across this country, as we all see.
Stereotypes, the terms we use, the vernacular, all of this, you're right, helps to marginalize trans communities. Dreya, can you talk about efforts to basically push back against that marginalization and the education that you provide? But I'd also like to transition to a discussion about resources. But briefly, if you could talk about the education that you provide. You speak to panels and to cisgender, non-educated people about trans issues across the Commonwealth. Address, how would you, what was the first thing you would say to someone who basically needs to get from point A to point B in terms of their understanding?
You know, when I do speak with those communities, I try to keep it simple because it is simple. I speak about, it comes to a point where we can constantly talk about the violence against trans women, trans people in general. But basically, I speak and I let them know, I'll educate you, but I keep it simple because it is simple. And the way I approach it is, I use my story. I start with my story, but at the same time, what I find is when I speak and I'm just very straight to the point, like I said, I don't speak about policies. I just speak about this. I tell them, this is who we are. We live our lives. We have normal lives that we live every day. Like I said, I've been discriminated against just because of my color of my skin, not only just because I'm trans. And I've experienced that I experienced, discrimination within the Black community, unfortunately. And like Chastity said, I don't feel there does need to be a gap bridge between Black Lives Matter and the Black community, because we are constantly judged, and there is this stigma, and there is the stigma that we're just sex workers and we just, we're all HIV positive. But no, we're pretty smart and we're pretty educated, and we go to college and we are, we live regular lives. We have relationships like everyone else. And I think that's what we need to start focusing on and showing people, that we live regular lives. We focus a lot on the violence and a lot of the negative things that are happening to us, but we need to start showing the positive sides. Chastity and I, we live lives. We have everyday problems. We call each other with problems in our relationships and everything. The point is, we live our lives. The word transgender seems to make everyone's brain go haywire. As soon as they hear that, I feel like myself and Chastity, we moved through this world I don't think you would be able to know, but if we were able, first time we say the word transgender, then it's like, oh, things change, and it shouldn't be that way. It's just that word, that title, transgender, and having to constantly educate, and thank you, Chastity, for the correction on transsexual, because we constantly have to educate like that. It shouldn't be that way. We are Black women, Black trans women, but at the end of the day, we are Black women.
And Dreya, as you pointed out, we know violence against transgender women has been a growing crisis, but homelessness is also a major problem. Last month, Vice News helped shed more light on the long-term impacts of the violence and neglect. Take a look.
I've always felt the full impact of the pain and the hurt and the suffering because I never resorted to drugs. So when I got assaulted, I felt the assault. When I got beat, I felt the beating. When I was left out there in the cold, sleeping on park benches, sleeping in tents, sleeping on the floor, sleeping on grates downtown, sleeping in dumpsters.
I wish I knew you back then.
I don't know.
We would have fallen into one of the warm beds upstairs, bro.
From day one, this woman has accepted me. No judgment, no ridicule. And that's why chosen family is so important, because you're choosing someone that is validating you.
Yes, you've seen this: violence, homelessness, psychological issues that are being addressed as a result of this trauma. But there's also efforts, as our guests have pointed out, to try to turn this around. So I would like to ask all of you about, if you will, we've talked about education, but Kaden, what efforts concrete efforts are basically being addressed to change the paradigm not just in terms of policy, as you pointed out earlier, but in terms of wholesale where we're not asking some of these questions. These questions are necessary now because a lot of people are frankly ignorant and have to basically be re-educated or conditioned to basically seeing people as an integral part of society. How does that happen?
I know you sort of said we already talked about education, but I am a huge proponent that really is a big part of it. And I think I want to sort of echo something that Chastity said and also something that Dreya said. One of the things I want to echo that Dreya said is it is about helping people understand that we are human beings, right? And that we're here trying to live our lives the way that everybody else is. And I think that requires education because a lot of people either think that they've never met a trans person, think that they don't know anybody that's trans, and they probably do, right? They probably have sat on a bus next to a trans person, walked past them in a grocery store. They just don't know. And I think when you can help people understand that we're here, we've always been here, we're part of your everyday life, even if you know it or not, I do think that it helps people to understand and start to break down some of the barriers that they're experiencing to really be able to accept and support trans folks. When I do education, I spend a lot of time also speaking very clearly to people about the fact that there is a misconception that we've come so far and don't have anywhere else to go. I think especially when we're talking about somewhere like Boston or Massachusetts, where we sort of live in a bubble of, progressiveness or liberalism or whatever word you want to call it. And there's a really big misconception that somewhere like Massachusetts, where we do have laws and policies in place, where we do have those legal protections, that everything's fine. We don't have any more to do. And I think that's a massive fallacy. And I think it's a dangerous thought as well, because it's not true, as we've discussed at length so far. So, for me, the education piece actually is really important to breaking those things down, breaking down the stereotypes, breaking down the barriers that trans folks are experiencing. The thing that I wanted to name that Chastity said was, oftentimes, unfortunately, it is trans people having to do that ourselves, right? Chastity sort of made a comment in her opening statement when she was talking about how she's doing and said, we've created a table because we didn't have a seat at the table ourselves. So, I think unfortunately, a lot of the time, this is being done by trans people saying, as Dreya said, I'm not going to sit here and let you tell me that I can't live my life. I'm going to live my life. And just by the nature of doing those things, I think we are sort of being put in the position of having to do a lot of that education, of having to do a lot of the work of breaking those barriers down ourselves. And I think we bring cisgender people along with us. Unfortunately, I would like to see it, cis people sort of taking the lead on their own sometimes. I just don't know that we've necessarily gotten there yet. So, I think for me, it's really the education piece is number one priority.
Okay, I'm afraid we're sadly just about out of time. And just briefly, if I could just ask Yvonne, is there a legal effort right now to basically allow people to live their lives, to basically counter the discrimination that so many trans people are facing, even here in Massachusetts?
Well, we've seen really great work coming from the Biden administration already. In January, for example, a reversal of the trans ban in the military that Trump had put into place. And also things that Trump had put into place, like forbidding the use of the term transgender for federal research and work that the NIH and the CDC are doing. Those things are now going to be reversed. And that has a trickle-down effect. That trickles down to the employers, the people who are really interfacing with trans folks day in and day out. And it has to be
Yvonne,
something for
and
the
I
back.
assume even here in Massachusetts, that's
Absolutely.
obvious. Okay. Well, look, I'm afraid that is the end of our broadcast. All of you have been fantastic, and it's the end of our show. Thanks to all of you and to all of our guests, and thank you for joining us, of course. Also, before we go, we want to acknowledge Boston's new acting mayor, Kim Janey. Janey becomes the first female and first black mayor of Boston when former Mayor Martin Walsh became the U.S. Labor Secretary. Stay with us as we continue our conversation on Facebook and Twitter. We are on Facebook and Twitter with our post-show continuing our conversation and discussion on the lives of transgender men and women. And I want to pick up where Yvonne left off with, again, some of the legal protections and some of the signals coming from the Biden administration and what that means for transgender communities here in Massachusetts.
Yes, Phil. One of the most important things, I think, goes back to some of the framing that you were doing at the very beginning of the conversation. Resources and conditioning, right? These are critical for being able to really bring trans lives and trans identities into the mainstream. Far too often, the reactions that my fellow panelists of experts is describing is what happens as soon as somebody is outed as trans. The discrimination starts, the scapegoating starts, the bullying starts, the violence starts. And so in doing things like reversing the trans ban in the military, I think that goes a long way in helping to do precisely what other panelists have been talking about, humanizing and door opening for trans communities. You know, the military is a big deal because it's a federal workplace. And if they're allowed in that workplace, then they should be allowed in all other workplaces, right? And so it's about creating opportunities that have further impact, that have a domino effect on the ground. And that includes here in Massachusetts.
I think humanizing is such an important term that you use. Chastity, like even when you see situations where and it's totally understandable. You get exhausted talking about or trying to educate people. But Kaden seems to be onto something when he says, because I find the level of ignorance, including my own, and many people I speak with, and I'm a pretty sharp person. I have a good sense of social justice, but I find a lot of people are really just sort of, if you will, behind in terms of understanding the integration of issues and and this notion of intersectionality. How would you, Chastity, again, without having, I get exhausted talking to people about racism. I can imagine you get exhausted talking to people about trans communities and the violence and things of that sort that you face. But is there a way of coming together in the middle? How do you basically find that the best way, if you will, to approach cisgender people about these issues without making yourself completely exhausted doing so?
Well, first and foremost, I don't mind exhausting myself for the betterment of my community, but it's all about education, like Kaden said, but it goes both ways when I see it. I see education for our allies and community members, but also my goal is to educate my other trans brothers and sisters and non-binary, because some of us think that I can't work in a hospital, they're not going to hire me. And so part of my job is not only educating, cisgender folks, but also educating my community members and open those doors for them. By, recently working in the hospital, opening doors, it was a trans woman that said to me, I never know we can work in the hospital. They will hire us. Yes, we can be whatever we want to be. So that's part of the matter too, as well, is educating our community members to let them know that you can be whatever you want to be. You could be that person who we're going to see down at Boston Housing Authority to apply for an application. As long as you put your mind to it, you can be whatever you need to be. And I think that once people see more of us trans people out in community and social services and government jobs and working in a courthouse as a transcriber or any of these social services, that's going to start opening up more doors for other trans people to realize, like, I don't have to only resort to my body to make money or sleep with people in order to have a place to stay. I can do that for myself. So I think the question of the matter is, how are we going to also educate our community, but also educate our cisgender folks as well? And I think that, we do a good job at doing both. You see Kaden doing his trainings, Dreya doing hers, and then me, I'm more so now focused on uplifting and building our community to be the strong community that I know that we can be. So I think that we need more education in schools as well. Some of these universities who are teaching these nurses and doctors who are going to be out in the field soon, when have trans patients have no idea what they're walking into. They don't even know what exams, some of them don't even know what exams that we need as a trans woman of color. So I think, yes, we have a lot of work to do. It's a lot of education that needs to be had. And I think that if we all do our part to continue this, that we will get somewhere. I have full hope and transparency within my community.
I appreciate that. Recently, I've been speaking with young folks at Roxbury Youth Works, and there are a number of trans young people who come in, who basically work with the program. And one of the questions, Dreya and Kaden, this question is for you as well. Do you find a difference in terms of attitudes, conditions, trauma of younger trans individuals and those who have basically been dealing with this for a longer period of time? Dreya, start with you.
Wow, I kind of just had this conversation the other day with someone regarding this. I think the younger community, trans community, LGBT community, they're somewhat aware, but not aware of the battles and the fights that we've had to. I'm 51, so for me, so when I see they're kind of, I don't want to say transparent, but I think their mindset is, they're so focused now on, I feel, labels. What is the pronoun? And I'm like, okay, we need to be known by our names. What myself and the older trans community, we are pushing for is to live our lives. So I don't, I guess with that being said, when I listen and I see some of the younger community, what I do find is that there's support. I think one of the things that is an example, when we find someone that is in the younger community that is trans, when they have support and that shows and they're successful, it's because they have support of family, have support of community. And I have seen a lot of that actually recently, within the younger community. And I think because they have that support, those that have that support, they're kind of not totally aware of the fight. It's there, but maybe they feel like they are exempt from it, but they're not. And so it kind of, unfortunately, I feel makes it a little harder for the older community that we're still out there fighting. Like I said, I'm 51 and I've kind of stepped back a little bit. I choose to advocate by just living my life as a trans woman of color and educate that way, So I do feel like they're a little bit laid back and their focus is not sometimes where it should be, and that's just my honest opinion.
Kaden, that same question to you. You came to Wellesley in 2010, a little over 10 years ago, still youngish. How do you find the if you will, the difference between young and older trans communities. And what Dreya pointed out is very interesting. You do find, I have found more support for some young trans people, but I still see some of the same issues that were, if you will, that manifest really in, for example, in the killing of Rita Hester in 1998, a very famous case here in the Boston area that's become a cause célèbre for trans communities around the country in terms of trying to understand the conditions and the hate and the discrimination faced by trans communities.
Yeah. I think it's interesting for a few reasons. One is that, I think young trans people is such a weird thing because people transition at different points in their life. So there could be somebody who is in their 50s or 60s and views themselves as being like a young trans person because they transition much later in life, right? So I think that's something just to put out there to think about is that people, not everybody grows up feeling or consciously understanding their identity and may come to that later on. So that experience, I think, can also play a really big factor in sort of how people relate to what's going on. I would agree with what Dreya was saying, though. I mean, I think that that's true for a lot of social issues, right? As I said before, we still have a really long way to go in terms of being supportive, welcoming, inclusive, valuing trans lives and trans people. But I'm not going to pretend I could have transitioned at Wellesley if I was there in 1955, right? I don't think that would have happened. So I think that there are some things that we have access to, right? Even thinking about having the internet, I was able to go on the internet and find information about what it means to be transgender. I was able to find stories of other people through that platform that we didn't have even 30 years ago, right? So I think there's a different level of access. I think there's a different level of resource. And I think there's a different level of general acceptance. And we as a society have moved to a different place. But I think to your point, Phillip, that doesn't mean that all the problems are gone. And, I still know plenty of young trans folks who are still experiencing rejection from their families, experiencing homelessness, experiencing food insecurity, and all of those things as well. So I think it's sort of what I said before, where we've come some distance from where we were. Things are better and easier, I think, for some trans folks that are coming out. It's possible even for them to do that. I don't know that it would have been possible for a 6-year-old to be trans 30 years ago, right? I don't think that would have happened, but it happens all the time now. So I think it's gotten easier. I think we still have a long way to go. And I do think that it can cause some tension sometimes between older and younger folks in the trans community. And I know my organization and other organizations are really trying to think more broadly about how to be more intergenerational in our work as well, so that we can sort of try to build a stronger community and bring the value that younger trans folks and older trans folks have, because those experiences are different, but both valuable.
Okay, thank you very much. Yvonne, is there a legal firewall to protect trans communities in Massachusetts, different, if you will, in a profoundly different way than what we're seeing in other parts of the country, where those walls are basically crumbling, where protections for transgender people, rather than advancing, are actually retreating. You're finding regression, especially in legislatures.
Well, it's certainly true that in conservative legislatures, the movement has certainly been backwards. But I want to underscore something that I believe it was Kaden who mentioned it earlier during the segment, which is just because you have the legal protections doesn't mean that those are available to you. And one thing that is still very much concerning is that many people have come to normalize the type of discrimination and violence that happens to them. There's significant underreporting of discrimination and hate crimes. And then that means that agencies and organizations that are supposed to be supporting trans people in crisis are not doing it, right? We need more action from the Attorney General's office. I'll even say we need more action from my own office, from Lawyers for Civil Rights, to protect and really step up to serve the legal needs of more trans people, especially trans people of color. And so I think there is tremendous invisibility to the trans community, and particularly the legal problems that are transpiring within the trans community. So I would not by any means say that we are in a bubble that is better or more protective. Absolutely not. And I think several of my co-panelists have already underscored the fact that we cannot get caught up in the myth. I think it was called a fallacy of living in progressive Massachusetts, because that's simply not true. And so just because we're not seeing a particularly heinous bill moving through our state house, that doesn't mean that the protections work. And so the conversation that we're having here today with people directly affected by the issue is critical to underscore how much more work we need to do to bring more compliance and enforcement to bear to help protect the lives of trans people in the Commonwealth, and particularly trans people of color who are more disproportionately likely to be subjected to discrimination, exclusion, and violence.
Yvonne, that's a good summary statement. And I'm wondering for the rest of our panelists, with just about 2 minutes to spare or less, if you could tell us what has to happen next in order for us to actually reach a point where that we might call progress. Dreya, start with you.
I'm going to say it, and I'll continue to say it. The society and allies, we need to start making choices with our hearts, not waiting for a policy to be put in place. We need to start working together because it's the right thing to do. It's not because, let me wait till this law gets passed. Let me wait till this policy gets passed. We are regular, normal, whatever normal is, individuals that live our lives. So what we need to do is start moving and showing that. And the society needs, and politicians, whatever, need to start making decisions just because it's the right thing to do, not because there's a policy in place. Because me personally will not, have not, and do not plan to wait until policies are put in place while I continue to move through this world. I've continued to take my place, my space, and I will help those, that want to follow me do the same without waiting for a policy.
Continue to take my place in space. I love that. Chastity.
For me, I think it's more so to my cisgender people of color to try to get yourselves educated, educate your friends and your family, because it just takes that one conversation. You never know, you could be saving someone's life. And I pray that we can bridge the gap between transgender women of color and cisgender women of color, because they are raising these Black men with some of these stigmas and stereotypes towards our community. And that's how we end up murdered. So I just want to hopefully open up these doors to educate people. People can check us out at transresistancema.com or transgenderemergencyfund.org to find out how can you be involved. It takes you to get from behind your computer and get involved in the cause, whether that be in an organization like mine, whether that be going after those politicians that we don't have time to go after too because we're living our lives. We need our allies. We need all allies to step up and stand out.
Thank you. Kaden, moving forward, how?
Yeah, I would definitely echo and agree with what Dreya and Chastity said. I would add another thing onto that, which would be, I think we really need to focus on some of the education happening within specific systems. I think, when we're thinking about how we train doctors, when we're thinking about how we train social workers, how we train anybody really in the medical field, how we train teachers, right? All of these people that are providing services, especially for youth, I think we need to be really mindful about how those things are happening and really put some intention and thought behind that. Because just to add this last thing, I think it's really important, as everybody here has said, for people to be able to see themselves in a future, right? To see themselves having the ability to do the things they want, the things that they dream of. And we need systems and people, and whether those people are in the systems or outside of them, all of us need to be able to get on board with that and recognize that, again, we're human beings just trying to live our lives.
I really appreciate it, all of you. This has been an extraordinary discussion. Chastity, Dreya, Kaden, Yvonne, thank you very much. And to our audience, thank you. This is Basic Black, and you've been listening on Facebook and Twitter.